This is the Fifth Estate winning headlines, your media police post. In this segment, we summarize some of the headlines that you might have missed this morning. But we also take a look at the political pieces that we call cartoons in this country. Today is the 8th of June 2020 and I am 2J.
I am JM.
And I am DM. Let's take a look at today's headlines. In the Daily Nation, why Uhuru's power deal with Ruto failed. The Standard, the new Uhuru. And finally the Star, Uhuru crafting legacy cabinet.
Strong headlines.
Very strong headlines. Let's begin with the Daily Nation.
Right.
So the National Assembly Parliamentary Group meeting that happened at State House last week must have been very loaded because once again the article on the Daily Nation is drawing from it, and this time is to tell us why Uhuru's power deal with Ruto failed. So they're quoting the president and they're saying that the president drew an analogy from a relay race, an analogy between the relay race and his presidency and his deputy president and their relationship. So he said, I got into a race, but as I was taking the baton towards the person who was supposed to take over, he got so impatient that he ran backwards to where I was to pick the baton from me and then to continue with the race.
Yeah, ran backwards to forcefully get it.
To forcefully get it.
Yeah.
And so the president then said there's no way one could win in such a race because he would become exhausted. What a telling analogy.
Yeah.
But also worth mentioning, quoted in the article, is Nandi Hills MP Alfred Keter, who said that if a student of political science wants to do a thesis on how not to become a president, they should just have a case study on William Ruto.
Wow. I think what's even more interesting, maybe something that maybe the president missed, I don't want to point that out, but when you talk about in a relay race, if somebody forcefully does something, you wouldn't just, run out of energy, you would be disqualified.
Yes.
Because that's illegal. You're not meant to do that in a race. There are rules that are in place for that reason. So I think disqualification.
Is he, 2J, is he in many words telling us just that?
Precisely.
By saying that somebody cannot win such a race. And I think in the Standard, we're in the same line of thinking.
Yes, definitely. The Standard, the new Uhuru, fantastic headline. They talk about transformation. Considered a reluctant leader, the president has morphed into a ruthless political tactician. Confounding friend and foe. Nobody, it seems, can stop his quest for legacy. So they outline how 25 months to the end of his presidency, the president who they say was once seen as a docile president, incapable of making hard tactics, has now kind of turned around. And I think we've seen that in the past maybe month or so, or in this corona moment, he has really taken this crisis and, turned it to his own benefit. And we don't know what the end game is. Is it legacy? Is it something more? But I think he has really shown that he has this force, he has this power. I will say, as much as it's a fantastic headline, I think they kind of miss the analysis or looking in depth into what the president has actually done. It's more of a narration of the
events of the past few weeks.
Nothing more.
They didn't give us a clear picture of what the new Uhuru looks like.
Exactly.
But I read this story and I wondered, should the new Uhuru have happened in 2018?
No.
Would he have stood a better chance of achieving a lot of his
goals?
Well, yes and no, but he was also facing a dilemma back in 2018. If you recall, he just entered the handshake in March. And so, he had to see how the handshake pans out, what the people feel, because you can't abandon, he couldn't have abandoned the deputy president for Raila without knowing exactly what the reaction, the lay of the land would be. Because if the deputy president and Raila decided to team up, for example, then he'd end up isolating himself.
But they already had the handshake.
Well, yes, but the handshake needed to be tested. Raila's loyalty and a commitment to the handshake needed to be tested.
So he was waiting for the right moment.
Waiting for the right moment.
I will say that usually when people are on their second term, they don't care.
Yes.
Unless you're preparing to have a third term. Anyway,
that's the opposite way around.
The Star.
In the Star, Uhuru crafting legacy cabinet. And so what they tell us is after overhauling the parliamentary leadership, the president is said to be shifting his focus now to cabinet, where a major shakeup is expected. We should expect this within the next 3 weeks, says the Senator Majority Chief Whip, Ruto and Kenyatta. And so the people to be axed are two groups. The first is the William Ruto allies. This is what the Star tells us. And then the second is anybody who has ambitions for 2022 and beyond. And the thinking here seems to be, if you have ambitions for 2022, be it governor, be it MP, whatever it is, then you're less likely to spend the amount of time required to implement the president's projects, the big four. Lastly, they've also told us that there's been a delay in appointing a government of national unity. And here there seems to be a dilemma as well. The government of national unity is supposed to bring in these people from the opposition. But because they're inherently as well political competitors, they may end up politicizing things a bit too much. I don't know why the government of the day is so reluctant to embrace politicians into cabinet and you know, have politicians out there really speaking the facts of what the government has.
The language of the people.
What a government and Uhuru's government has achieved.
But it is a catch-22, Jem, because then the president is saying he doesn't want people who will be politicking, but he wants people who will be doing their work.
It's a fine balance, I think.
A politician cannot change his stripes. If you're if you're in an office or wherever you are, that persona still remains. And I think that is part of the flaws that we have in our system, right up from the deputy president downwards. As a politician in office, you're constantly thinking about your next
move,
election. You can't be redundant for a while. Anyway, who gives us our winning headline?
Okay, honestly, I think all three headlines are fantastic. It's nice to wake up on a Monday morning and see positive headlines that are outlining things that are actually happening.
Absolutely. Let's weigh them against the three-part criteria that we have. Is the headline topical or speculative? Is it repetitive or groundbreaking? And finally, is it thoughtful or just plain lazy? I thought the standard one was quite thoughtful.
Great headline. Not, but the
article itself. The Daily Nation is extremely topical, and it does deliver because it gives us insights on truly why this power deal failed.
Yeah.
Do we vote for it?
Yeah.
Oh, guys, could I just suggest something crazy? Why don't we give the winning headline to all three?
Absolutely. A nice Monday.
A nice Monday.
Why not? Why not?
Well done, editors. All the papers give us our winning headline. And on to the political pieces that we call cartoons in this country. And just like the headlines, we have a three-part criteria that we use to break them down for you. We ask, is the cartoon humorous or is it dry? Is it satirical or is it pessimistic? And finally, is the cartoon effective or just plain lazy? What do we have in the Daily Nation? The Daily Nation, we have the police brutality report desk, and we have a police officer who is holding an investigation report that is noticeably empty, and he's walking in circles, out one door, through into the next. And I think here the context is that Matiang'i had asked Inspector General Hilary Mutambai to develop a report looking into the police brutality that has been taking place over the past couple of months. Strangely enough, this order was sent through Twitter, which I think is quite interesting. We're now asking our colleagues to do work via Twitter. On social media.
Yeah, but I will say I think it's a bit of a negative cartoon. It's telling us that nothing is ever going to change. But of course, this is hot off the heels of the protests that are happening around the world for Black, Black Lives Matter, police brutality and justice.
I think to that extent, it has some level of being effective because this is something that is very present in a lot of people's minds around the world, and even here in Kenya, especially after the curfew laws were put in place. It's okay. The
Standard. In the Standard, we have a boxing match, and it is Kenyans versus lockdown. Kenyans have been battered. They're on the floor, unable to get up. And standing above them, looking quite menacing, is lockdown. A very big, bulky lockdown with a padlock on his head. And in the corner, I think he's sticking his tongue out. Is that corona?
No, he has a whistle.
It's a whistle. Oh, he's the referee. All right.
But if he was sticking his tongue out, it would be just as well.
Just as good. Yeah. So the referee in this case here is coronavirus. That means that it's kind of skewed, right? It's not in the favor of Kenyans. And lockdown is saying, come on, 30 more rounds to go.
Yeah.
So, okay, there's a spelling error there. I don't think he meant to write come on.
Yeah.
But I think, of course, here in reference to the statement made by the president on Saturday.
That
telling
broke
us,
Kenyans' hearts.
Broke our hearts.
Across the
30
country.
more days of lockdown, 30 more days of curfew.
Yeah.
It continues.
Yeah, but it is what it is. There's sacrifices that need to be made. I mean, we're not in normal times, as Mutahi Kagwe has continuously told us.
Yeah.
So I think those are the sacrifices that we need to make until we come to the end of this pandemic.
Yeah, true. We'll be grateful for it in the end.
Precisely.
All right.
Today,
in the Star, we have a caricature of President Kenyatta on 2 podiums. In the first one, above him is a bubble with expectations written on it. And in the second one, the president has popped the bubble as he addresses Kenyans.
Fellow Kenyans.
You can see the effect there, poof. And that cartoon relates to how, once again, Kenyans expected the curfew and lockdown to be lifted over the weekend speech. But obviously it was extended by another 30 days.
Yeah.
Ozone has made it look like the president enjoyed it. Like he was very gleeful about busting people's bubbles.
Yeah. I think of all the cartoons, I would go with Ozone of the Star.
I think so too. It's
the most interesting
humorous.
one. I think.
It's very satirical. And it's true. It's a reflection of what happened.
It's happening right now. That's true.
On Saturday. So the Star gives us our winning cartoon. So what is our final thought?
And now our final thought. Today is inspired by a book entitled Upheaval: Turning Points for Nations in Crisis, written by Jared Diamond in 2019. So the central idea behind this book, Upheaval, draws from both history and also from psychology. Diamond theorizes that nations in crisis can learn from the experiences of people in crisis and the therapies that have been used to treat those people. And so he asked this question: could these things that are used for people in crisis, could these things be the same for countries? And he believes that it is true. And so Diamond is a professor of geography at the University of California, and he's also the author of several books, one of which we covered last year, the Pulitzer Prize-winning Guns, Germs, and Steel. So drawing on the work of therapists, Diamond reports that the key for individuals coping in a crisis is selective change. He says people who successfully overcome a problem tend to identify the problem, isolate it, and figure out which parts of their identities are already functioning well and don't need changing, versus those which are no longer working and therefore need to be adapted. And so it may seem a bit of a stretch comparing the crises of people with that of countries, but Diamond blends logical analysis and historical narrative to make more than just a self-help book for governments. But he details, using 7 countries, the past upheavals that they have gone through, using self-appraisal and bold adaptation. He makes a case for learning from history and applying these lessons to our global future. So as I said, his method in this book is a case study, and he looks at Finland, Japan, Chile, Indonesia, Germany, Australia, and the United States at these pivotal moments that they had in their histories, and he evaluates the course of actions that they took in those moments of crisis. So he employs what he calls is a crisis therapy framework, relating to the success of people in navigating their own upheavals and adapts them to nations. So some of the items in the framework are national consensus that one's nation is in crisis. So in some of the stories, he talks about how in Indonesia, for example, there was a national consensus in the country that we have a crisis and therefore we need to change. Whether a national consensus on crisis can happen 100%, I don't know if that's true. But he talks about honest national self-appraisal and situation-specific national flexibility. So he examines Finland in its war after the with the Soviet Union. He looks at Chile and the legacy of General Pinochet. He looks at Japan's response to foreign interference in the 19th century, Indonesia after the Suharto massacres, Germany's post-war rebuilding and rebranding after the Nazi era, and Australia's search for a post-colonial identity. And in each case, he really describes how these vastly different countries overcame their challenges in this 12-step framework that he has. And so it may seem like a very random selection, looking at all these 7 countries that, on the face of it look very different. But the unifying theme is that Diamond has actually lived in each of these countries, and he speaks all of the languages he lived in all of them for a long time. And he speaks all of the languages except Japanese, I believe.
And Australian.
And Australian, of course.
The English is very
good day, mate. And so the way we deal with crisis is by changing ourselves in some respect. And he says that recovery is a balance between retaining those aspects of our outlook that have proved helpful and forging new ways of dealing with difficult circumstances. But he says, first and foremost, the first objective is recognizing that you're in a crisis, because there is no solution if you can't diagnose the problem. A book I would definitely recommend. Good read.
Very good read.
Let me turn to Chile. Chile's moment of political crisis was in 1973, and overnight we see the country flipped from a democracy to a dictatorship, or more specifically what we call bureaucratic authoritarianism, and I'll explain that shortly. And so historically we're told that Chile started off quite well. It was an exceedingly stable country. From 1925 onwards, it had enacted multi-party laws, and so people enjoyed considerable political freedom. And there were three parties that emerged now to basically, rotate in political leadership. The first was a left-wing one, a right-wing one, and a centrist one. And in 1970, the centrist candidate Salvador Allende won the election by a slim margin, receiving 36% of the vote. And with such a slim majority, we're told he was unable to govern in peace. What is worse, however, is that he decided to enact a policy of Marxism, which involved nationalizing the nation's copper mines. And so that process essentially alienated the United States, who were a big investor at the time. The policy also failed to compensate them for all the money and the investments that poured in to the country for the longest time. So the essentials in this case, the international community, the United States, ended up not being very happy. They imposed some sort of sanctions. They didn't put foreign aid across, and at that time Chile was a developing country. And so the policies backfired. The country became very disgruntled. Citizens started going to the streets and so on and so forth. Food shortages, inflation. And so on the 11th of September 1973, a junta, which is a political formation backed up by the military, did a coup, and they were successful. We're told Allende committed suicide, shooting himself with a gold-plated machine gun that was gifted to him by fellow Marxist Fidel Castro during a state visit not too long ago. Not too long before that. Very sad ending for him. At first, the junta had planned to share power between a group of military generals, but they decided to give it to a man known as Augusto Pinochet, who at the time seemed a very likable, nice, reasonable man. Of course, he went ahead, seized that opportunity and just consolidated power, which he did. He killed a lot of people in the opposition. But on the flip side, he ended up turning the economy around. And so we're told in 1975, he put the economy in the hands of the Chicago Boys. Those were a group of economists who'd studied at the University of Chicago. They enacted a series of reforms, economic reforms, which ended up really doing well for Chile. The mines were opened up again, foreign investment began to come up again. And so under his leadership, the rate of inflation went from 600% to 9%.
Wow.
All the while, the economy grew at about an average of 10% each year for a very long time. And he also shrunk the poverty line from 24% to 5% under his reign. And so the author tells us Chile is an example of how even a dictatorship with selective changes can work for countries.
Oh, wow. I think the undertone there with Diamond is that especially developing countries, the formula is to align yourself with America, otherwise you're destined to fail. You said Pinochet looked to the Chicago Boys. In Indonesia, he said they looked to the Berkeley. So they're called the Berkeley Mafia.
I didn't explain what bureaucratic authoritarianism is. It's basically when the military takes over, and so they're in charge of the country, but they delegate the actual day-to-day running of the country to professional bureaucrats. So it's a league of people like Chicago Boys, economists, and they're the ones experts in their field. They make decisions on how to run the country, how resources are allocated, and so on and so forth.
That doesn't sound like a bad idea.
And that formula works. Maybe it's something we should experiment with here in Kenya.
I don't know if I agree entirely, but let's go to the other side of the world, to Australia. And the story of crisis in Australia is quite unique because unlike other countries, Australia did not seek independence from their colonizer. Their colonizer, Britain, abandoned them. But I don't know to what extent it is honest to call them colonizers, as Diamond called them in the book, because Australians are really originally British people. Yeah. If we were speaking about an Aboriginal government, then we can honestly say that they were their colonizers. Anyway, so following World War II, after 1945 and going into the 50s, Australia's crisis was that Britain had decided to reduce its military presence in the region, number one, and then also it had severed its trade ties with Australia and instead had chosen to trade more with wider Europe for good reason. So this was a signal to Australia that Britain was no longer intending to protect them in a military sense and also to financially support them. So Australia entered into a crisis of trying to figure out its national identity and its economic path. Even today, apparently, over 50 years later, a lot of Australians apparently are bitter about Britain leaving them, their mum leaving them. So, and it was a big deal at that time because just coming off of the war, a lot of countries had war in their mind. So they felt very exposed to not have big military backup. So anyway, Australia had to figure out how to establish its own national identity and function and thrive without its former colonial relationship. So the idea of national identity did not get off to a very good start. Their first the immigration post-war minister, Arthur Caldwell, was openly racist. And what he did is that he pushed for a policy called White Australia. Wow. Australia would only accept white immigrants. Remember that Australia has always been a huge country with few people. So at that time, they were accepting, a labor force. But they had to be white. A lot of people came from South Africa, but only white ones. It wasn't until 1972, actually, when the Labour Party came into power, that things started changing. Oh my gosh. And that is where Jared Diamond's selective change happened. That's when it began to take off. So the new Prime Minister was called Whittam, enacted a comprehensive plan to improve relationships with Australia's neighbours. Imagine a country that had totally neglected their neighbours because they were relying on Britain. So now they looked, Papua New Guinea is here, let's form diplomatic relationships with them. But even more importantly, China. China was a huge, and still is, a very huge market for Australia as a mining country. A lot of exports go there. But I'm wondering really if the policy change was based on a new identity of a multiracial Australia or was just based on logistics and economics. They had to be pragmatic and join the Asia Pacific body. At this point, I don't know if Australia has really overcome its challenges because the Aboriginal people, I mean, it's like... You said 1972? 72. Were you already born today?
No, that's an odd 40-something years ago.
So. It really isn't. It really isn't long ago for there to be such an explicit white racist policy. Yeah. Anyway, on a day, an extraordinary Monday, where we had all dailies winning the headlines, and we had the winning cartoon from the Star. Please remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're also on your TV screens on Pang Free to Air, Star Times, and Go TV. Have a good evening and see you tomorrow.